So the recording has started now, and so Vince, you're going to talk about, I guess the title is Productizing Moqui through AWS Marketplace, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. It's one thing sort of I was thinking about after the last session, after we were meeting there, the nature of Moqui is that it is an open source project purely. There's no money involved, not even any ways for money to be involved. There isn't even a legal entity, and that's intentional. That's part of the licensing design even, so that it stays just about the software and collaboration in the community around it. And to make Moqui useful for different types of organizations, especially for smaller organizations, I guess I should back up a little bit. Using Moqui to choose to use Moqui is a choice to be responsible for your own software. And that may include hiring service providers to help out, or using external infrastructure and such, infrastructure service providers and so on. And especially for scaling down, that's critically important, because modern software, especially something like Moqui, is sufficiently complex that for a very small company to go on their own, it's not usually feasible unless they have a particular person on staff they can keep, or people on staff, and they can keep those people on staff over time to maintain and customize the system and such. And I don't know how relevant that is to what you're getting into, Vince, but after our last discussion, those are some things, and hopefully that transitions into what you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the intro, David. And I think that the opening up of the conference was a very good intro into this topic as well. A couple of points. First off, I'm a huge fan of the Simon Sinek Start With Why that Michael referenced, and I dropped a link to an old, like 2009, I think, TED Talk that is worth watching. I think for everybody, it's a powerful message. And I would say something that not a lot of software companies, or probably more generally companies in general, really do in terms of, most of the why about these companies exist is to make money, and that's kind of where it stops, even if they may have some larger vision statements or things that they do use, at least for marketing purposes. It really comes down to making money. And I think that so that's something for all of us to think about in terms of both, participating in Moqui as an open source community, and its role in the software in the software industry, I guess. And then also, how do we, and this is where I'm going to kind of segue into, is more of like, how do we commercialize it? How do we get, because at the end of the day, it's like we can have a great purpose, but we also have to make money, right? We also, that's kind of, that's what makes the world go round, or at least the currency by which we do it. So we have to have an economic model, financial model, and my personal motivation to get into the kind of that last segment of Michael's session of, like, in terms of stories, anybody that joins our biweekly calls has heard me speak ad nauseum about, lamenting about working with commercial software vendors, like, Salesforce and NetSuite and all the kind of the big name brands in the ERP and the CRM space. And but the fact is, I work with them because that's where the money is. And that's where you can make a comfortable living as a consultant, and everybody's using their products, and it's an indicator that, and this is no knock against Moqui or any other open source whatsoever. These products are by and large far inferior in terms of design and capabilities, but they're far more successful commercially. And so why is that? Well, it's because if you look at, and even there, it was mentioned earlier about what your experience on the plane ride here, Michael, of, somebody asking you what series you're in terms of funding. it's what if you look at what most of those companies are spending that money on, it's on sales and marketing. And so, the product development takes a backseat to promoting the product and acquiring customers. And in many cases, acquiring that customer base is very well funded, meaning they're basically buying customers. So the software industry is a bit of an anomaly, I think, in that regard. I mean, I suspect that happens to some degree in other industries, maybe in an early stage company, but software is notorious, especially with the advent of SaaS, to like spending a lot of money and a lot of investor money on acquiring customers. And I hope I'm not picking on our gracious host at all in this regard as a software and a SaaS software company. So.
No business people in the room.
So, somehow we have to thread that needle of, being somewhat altruistic and having, larger vision and also making it profitable. And I know this is a long-winded intro into, I actually didn't know what the topics were going to be in the opening up of the conference, but I really appreciate it. And it kind of levels up the conversation a bit, I think. So it's kind of that, how do we stick to our values as far as open source and freedom of software and democratization of technology, and also be practical about making a living. And then I think the other point I wanted to make before jumping into the topic that I'm going to present is I've forgotten it. So now I'll come back to it. We'll jump in. I'll come back to, I had a point I wanted to make. I'll come back to it when I think of it. So what I'm going to talk about is I'll actually go ahead and just show let me share my screen. And I'm going to start with what is this product that I'm talking about. Sorry, I can't talk and chew gum at the same time. Okay, you all should see my screen now. Let me know. Can we get? Okay, great. So, as many of you know who have listened to me on other calls, that I'm a management consultant by trade. I have a history a long time ago with OFBiz, primarily using it for e-commerce, and started tinkering around with Moqui when David moved on to that, and have started to pay much more attention to it in the last few years as it's matured, and I've started looking at kind of how do I maybe make my way back into the open source realm and out of the commercial software realm, or at least make open source a component of what I do. So what I do and what I'm going to talk about in terms of this kind of productizing something on AWS is very much around a particular industry, and in this case it is the software industry, which I think speaks also to the flexibility of Moqui, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But if you think about, what I do as a consultant and the folks that I've been working with for several years in the SaaS space, that provide solutions in this space, what we basically do is what I call everything in between CRM and ERP. And you can debate those lines as to, where we're kind of reaching further upstream or further downstream, but this kind of makes for a simple message. But this is an area that software companies struggle with a lot with the name brand players in the software space. And that is around, when you think about the SaaS and just software business models of, there's straightforward subscription models of just like per seat per month or per seat per year. You may charge, $7.99 per user per month or something like that. Those are fairly straightforward. They're billed in advance. There's some revenue recognition complications on the back end, but it's a fairly straightforward subscription model, not much different than subscribing to a newspaper or a magazine. The much more complex models that are becoming more the norm and the direction everybody's going in the software space are the consumption models. And that is there's any number of ways to slice and dice that. the classic ones on the cloud providers like AWS are, some combination of, compute, memory, storage, data transfer, all of these things. And then there's a lot of companies that are, selling their products in these marketplaces. I'm going to talk specifically today about the AWS marketplace. And so those companies have basically some pricing model that sits on top of the kind of the infrastructure pricing model of their compute, storage. Amazon's going to charge somebody for all of that, no matter what. But then in terms of selling your software product on the marketplace, you can have your own pricing model that sits on top of it. And then it's just a question of kind of who's paying the underlying infrastructure costs. But what I'm trying to do in terms of, let's call it a product on Moqui. First thing I want to say what it's not. I'm not out there promoting Moqui as just a general purpose ERP system that is an alternative to something like NetSuite or Oracle or SAP. You could certainly promote it that way. That's not my objective with this product. It is specifically to solve this space in between CRM and ERP. Let's call CRM things like account and opportunity management, basically the very upfront sales activities of salespeople just kind of managing their customers and tracking sales opportunities. And then at some point they have to start actually quoting deals, getting signatures, and managing subscriptions and billing customers and all of those things. And then ultimately we need to feed that. When I say ERP here, I'm really just talking purely about financials. So think of it literally in terms of like maybe feeding GL transactions to a backend ERP system so they can do whatever financial reporting and consolidations and things that companies might need to do. The reason I make that distinction is because these first off, companies are going to use commercial CRM and ERP, even if something like Moqui could be and is a better alternative. These are just like name brands people are comfortable with. They know them. That's what they're going to use. And especially on the back end on ERP, they want financial systems that are name brand. They're known. They've gone through, all kinds of industry certifications and approvals and, things that, may be more like credentials on paper than anything, but they mean something to somebody. And so we're not trying to overtake that space. We're trying to solve the space in between that software companies struggle with around quoting and billing and managing all of the things that are very specific to this complex and growing more complex software go-to-market space where we have all these different kinds of subscription and consumption models, and it becomes very complicated to manage. And these commercial out-of-the-box CRM and ERP systems like Salesforce, like NetSuite, simply weren't designed. They're not flexible enough to really support these business models. So we need to put them in their box, use them what they're good at, not try to use them for what they're not good at. I'm going to pause there because I know I just said a whole lot. I'm going to pause before I jump into the AWS side of this and start showing you. I'm going to actually show you my AWS management console and launching of products. So I want to pause there and see if anybody has any questions about everything I just said.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. All right. So we'll jump into the AWS piece now. And then if we have time, I'll give you a very, very quick, actually, I'll just go ahead and give you a quick, preview here when we, and I'll come back to this if we have time, but basically the solution that I'm building for this particular space is really around contracts and subscriptions, which in Moqui, those are, the contract is the agreement, and we can get into a little bit of how the data model is really flexible in terms of supporting. If you think about these consumption models, it's not like an order in the sense that we're going to sell somebody something, charge them for it right away, possibly charge a credit card, possibly send an invoice, collect the payment, ship them something, that's not the transaction. The transaction is more of like, we're setting up an arrangement, right? And we're setting up an arrangement for, you're going to pay X amount per consumption unit, and we're going to charge you at the end of the month based on that consumption. It's things like that. So it's more like setting up an arrangement that says, what is the pricing that we're going to charge somebody in the future based on their consumption? And so in the example of this product, rather than using orders, I'm centering that around agreements and leveraging things like the product price entity to manage like future dated changes when prices can change or the contract ends, things like that. So that's kind of the quick flyover of what the product is. But I want to jump into the AWS side of it. So I originally, just so everybody knows, I originally started down this path a month or so ago, more as a way, thinking of it as a way to promote my professional services, because I'm first and foremost a consulting firm. And I'm not trying to be a software company to the point we talked about earlier of like, I don't have my Series A yet, so I'm not funded. And so professional services are a much easier, low cost of entry way, and it's what I do for a living, so to speak, anyway. So I originally went down the path of, there's these marketplaces out there. There's a lot of software companies selling their products on this space, and every one of these companies that's selling their products on, and they're all working with the three major platforms. They're working with AWS, they're working with GCP, and they're working with Azure, at least. They're all working with, they're all selling their wares on at least all three of these marketplaces. And all of these marketplaces handle things slightly differently. So it's a pretty complex thing to manage. And there's thousands of software companies selling their products in these marketplaces. And so my original intent was the marketplace is a place I can find customers, basically, was the original intent for professional services to help people solve these problems, as I was describing earlier, of that space between CRM and ERP. They're all struggling with it. And it is, that is the customers I work with every day. They're trying to solve the problems with commercial tools like Salesforce and ERP systems, and integration tools and data tools and all kinds of other messes. So I originally saw this as a target market for my professional services. I learned very quickly. I will show you. So we're in my management portal now, and I will show you. So you can see here in the products, there's a professional services option. And you can see here, I have a product called Quote to Revenue Services for software companies. And this is the product I set up first in AWS. And I was like, this is great. I'm going to launch my professional services product. I'm sure the business will start pouring in. And then I went to request. You can see up here, there's request changes to update product visibility. You can see right here, the status of this product is limited right now. If you go to AWS Marketplace right now, you will not find this product. The only people that can see this product are because I'm logged into AWS right now, or if somebody else that has access to my account was logged in, you would be able to see this product. The long and short of that is they won't change my product status to public until it's actually associated with an actual software product. So in other words, they won't just let you go in and pitch your professional services on their marketplace. They want it to be connected to something they will actually make money on, which makes sense, and that's fair. And so, but the reason I started with the professional services piece was because it's something quick and easy, as I said before, the low cost of entry. You're selling the knowledge already in your head. So it's something easy to get out there quickly. The reality is I've been working on this sales component in Moqui for a very long time, and adding this concept of agreements to support software companies themselves. And so I said, when I found out they wouldn't make my professional services product public, I said, great, well, I will just, and I had some back and forth with their support. And I said, great, well, I'll go ahead and launch a software product. And so I put this product out there called solve CPQ and billing. I'm using these terms intentionally, even though the scope is a little bigger than just CPQ and billing, but this is CPQ is configure price quote. And this is just terminology folks in this space are familiar with. So I'm trying to use words they're familiar with. But the intention here is, and you can see this, the status of this is limited right now as well. I'm waiting on, I have a request out right now for them to go ahead and make it public because we put all the product information in. We're going to get into the deployment model in a second because this was all Docker image stuff that a lot of folks on this call know way more about than I do. So you'll probably have questions that I can't answer. But the long and short of this is I am putting this product out there as a free and open source. So I'm using, let's see, I don't think it's showing us that information here. It's not showing us the license information. But there's all kinds of pricing models you can use on these marketplaces. You can do this container approach, which is just a Docker image or Kubernetes, and put pricing associated with it. That gets into a lot more complexity around managing the pricing and how you charge for it and track usage and all this stuff. And so what I'm doing initially here is just putting this out for free. So somebody could conceivably go to Amazon Marketplace, subscribe to it, install the Docker image on one of their AWS machines and start using it at no cost. The reality is, like any more generic ERP system or Moqui generically, you don't just pick it up and start using it. So the intention here is anybody that would actually express interest, it would drive professional services business. I do hope as that progresses to potentially turn this into a full-blown software product where you're actually charging, or maybe is more of a combined full service option of almost like outsourcing. It's a combination of technology, people, and process that just know how to run these businesses. Because that's another thing I see operationally in these software companies. I work with their sales and finance teams every day. Most people don't actually know how to run these businesses, and they really do a terrible job, and they make a total mess that creates a ton of operational overhead. And so I see an opportunity here for this to not just necessarily be a software offering, but more of a full services. Don't even worry about the technology that's actually operating your business. Just we're gonna outsource this Middle Earth between CRM and ERP. We're gonna outsource that. We're gonna operate very efficiently, and you all focus on doing what you're good at, which is building whatever your core product is and marketing and selling the heck out of it. This kind of gets, so that's all the kind of the business end of this stuff. And I haven't talked to any about the tech. I don't even know how the tech works. I had one of my guys do all this stuff in terms of setting up repositories and creating Docker images and uploading those and all of that. But that is the deployment. There's lots of different deployment options on AWS in terms of AMIs or containers and all kinds of different pricing models, like I mentioned earlier, that you're welcome to read about in the AWS documentation. But the simple way to do this was, Docker image, which is already fairly well documented in the Moqui community as to how to do that, upload it to a repository in AWS and make it available. So I'm going to pause. Thoughts, questions, comments? Anybody else? Is anybody else doing anything like this? Is anybody else publishing the, kind of some software product built on Moqui out on any of these marketplaces?
First, I was wondering, Vince, so you were showing a screen that looks like it was a custom screen you built in Moqui. Is that, so you built a kind of an application based on Moqui, and then that's what you're selling in this, or selling
right.
or offering through the marketplace?
That's correct. So if we want to, here's a simple version of like, what is it? So if somebody were to install this image, what do they get? They get Moqui with a custom sales application. And we've intentionally only packaged, like we packaged Marble, but we didn't package any of the other, you don't see obviously HiveMind here, you don't see PopC. We have Marble, we have our custom sales component. I went ahead and threw in this work management component that we built a long time ago, just because it works and I think it's useful. But the sales component is really what this is a part of. What I'm showing you here is a different version. That's what's out on the image. We're in the process of, you see all these menu options here that say new. It's because these are the Quasar screens. We're rebuilding all the screens in Quasar. And so, but this is really the heart of it, is centered around this agreement and being able to, a lot of times the way I talk about this with my clients are, you have to set up your arrangement. Like people have to, you have to have a single place to be able to understand what is the arrangement you have with a customer and how does that change over time. And so you can see here, for example, we have, items on the agreement that are basically price changes. So say this were a 3-year contract, and they have maybe a spend commitment. They're going to spend, and I'm calling these like solve cloud units, just as a kind of a way of charging, some form of consumption, and this is, by the way, I'm not making this up. This is a model one of my clients uses, and they're not the only one, where they have kind of a list price of $1 per unit. And they do a lot of kind of magic behind the scenes in terms of like, translating that consumption coming from the actual like raw usage on the platforms, like the compute and memory and storage and all that stuff. That's infrastructure costs. And they have a whole formula for kind of translating all that into a single unit with a markup for what they charge their customers, to just kind of keep it simple from a customer facing perspective. And so everything basically evaluates to $1, and then they discount off of that based on things like long-term spending commitments. And so they're setting up an arrangement to manage this customer over time, which you could then envision like consumption comes in every month. You run a process that's going to generate invoices and possibly capture payments against a credit card, that is based on like reading the information off of this agreement and saying, oh, okay, we're between this date and this date. They have a price of 80 cents per unit.
It'd be cool to just get like a demonstration of what their application looks like.
This is it.
This is it.
The agreement screen is the center of the universe on this one. This depends on, by the way, and I think it's important to emphasize, like, this depends on so much under the hood that is very flexible. We're using parties. I have a client, for example, they sell under about 8 different legal entities. So slight sidebar, and I've mentioned this in the community calls, but one of the ways I use Moqui, and actually one of the reasons I started building this in the first place really, was not to convince people to use it as an alternative to commercial software, but to demonstrate to them what is possible, to demonstrate to them like what good design looks like and how they can operate their businesses if they think about it the right way. And that was kind of the origin of this. But this is all very dependent on the party model, obviously leveraging the agreement model here, and subscriptions. And then one of the things that there's some complexities in this model of software companies where, the bill to might be, let's say that they are consuming through AWS. In other words, AWS there's a lot of third party, fourth party relationships there. They might be working with a reseller. They might be working with they might have come through the hyperscaler or the infrastructure provider to buy your software. If we go, looking at all the software available on AWS and you just click on it and subscribe, well, you're buying it through the marketplace. And so the way these companies conduct their operations is when that consumption comes in every month, it's not going to be, the end customer that's paying this bill. It's going to be the infrastructure provider, because the infrastructure provider is collecting the money from the customer. So you have a lot of, indirect sales relationships here that you need to be able to manage. And so you need to know, for example, that, the bill to maybe AWS instead of the end customer themselves, but you certainly need to know who the end customer is as well and have a direct relationship with them. So it's leveraging a lot of the under the hood capabilities of Moqui, particularly party model agreements. And I've found that, the products and pricing, particularly the product price table, is actually a really good and flexible alternative to, if you compare it to some of the structures of a lot of the kind of the traditional subscription billing systems out there, like Recurly or Zora, or even more of the, newer more consumption based. There's products out there called like Metronome and Billing Platform. There's a lot of very consumption based billing systems out that really just focus on billing. And I've found that the Moqui product catalog and pricing data model is actually very applicable and much more flexible, in the sense that, you can mimic the way those tools structure their designs, because they all talk in terms of plans. You have to remember, a lot of these folks came out of telecom. So they structure it in terms of like you have a product and products have plans, and you have to be able to manage trial periods and all this sort of thing. And you can do all of that with the product catalog in Moqui if you just think about it the right way and think in terms of, leveraging start and end dates, leveraging things maybe like max quantities. You can completely mimic these business models in a more flexible way. And the last point I'll make on that to make that point is, a lot of these companies don't just sell software. And so, if you go get a subscription billing system like Zora, it has no concept of billing professional services, billing training, billing physical goods. Can't do it. So now you're in a situation where if you are a multi-product company or, have other business models, maybe you sell physical goods and subscriptions, or you have a large professional services or training component to your business, you have to have multiple billing systems or multiple systems if you're going to try to use one of these traditional subscription or consumption billing engines and sell these other things. You're now in a situation where you've got to have multiple systems to support all those different business models. Whereas with Moqui, you could actually do it all in one. The thing that I'm not showing here in terms of quote unquote a demonstration, and the reason I'm focusing so much on the agreement is because in these consumption models, it's all about like setting the relationship up correctly up front so that you can then run the engine on a monthly basis correctly. And so what I'm not showing you here is something like, well, what if usage came in and we ran a job to read that usage and grab the right line item and say, oh, this usage is still within this time frame and we haven't exceeded this quantity, so they're going to get 80 cents per unit on their bill. But that would all be very standard, other than a very, very simple job to kind of process, let's call it usage that's ready for billing. Like the only thing we haven't done is apply a price to it yet. Let's say that's coming in from a proper metering engine or something. All we're really doing from the from this agreement going forward, all we're really doing is using out of the box Moqui stuff. We're generating invoices, we're hitting, GL, we're capturing payments, all the classic financial activities.
How do you plan on marketing software on the marketplace?
I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm working on getting it public, and then this is also a learning experience just in terms of getting familiar with these marketplaces. I know they have lots of tools and things available for promoting products and things like that. I want to refine the product itself a little bit more. To your question, Michael, just so it can look and feel more like kind of like a proper demo. The reality is I could have a software company up and running in, less than 90 days, probably even with, payment processing and integrations with other systems and lots of, fairly complex things. You could have somebody up and running pretty quickly, starting from this starting point, but it needs to look a little bit more like an end-to-end. Like you need to be able to walk in to a sales opportunity, give an end-to-end demo. Like, look, I set up an agreement for somebody and then some usage came in and then I billed for it. And then they made a change 6 months into that agreement. And so we adjusted pricing and, gave prorated credits and all this kind of stuff. Or one of the things that is important to know about how these marketplaces operate, and you'll hear terms like private offers, like they'll do a lot of like annual, all these software companies will maybe their standard pricing model at list price is monthly, but they'll do an annual deal and give you a discount. And a lot of times that requires upfront payment to track that. Moqui financial accounts lend themselves very well to tracking that customer balance. And then it's just a matter of doing the accounting under the hood to, keep that in a liability account and just kind of every month, once they actually consume usage, you move some of that money into revenue. But again, that's all out of the box kind of standard Moqui financial capabilities, and the financial account model lends itself very well to that. I went off the question of like, how are you going to market it? But it's first get the products launched. I'm going to start exploring the different ways within the marketplaces themselves to promote. I know very little about that. Actually, if anybody on the call does know much about any of that, if they've done it before, I'd love to hear about it. I'll take that as a no. Sounds like nobody's actually putting any kind of like packaged Moqui software-based product out on marketplaces today. Is silence acceptance in that statement?
I would say so, yeah.
Do we see it as maybe to go back to the, to the kickoff to the conference, in the spirit of like, Moqui is open source. It's not a commercial open source model. So there's no company behind it. There's no funding behind it. So we have to find other ways of getting the word out there. Is this a way?
It certainly is a way, and I think it dovetails nicely in what I'm going to be talking about later. So, we'll have further discussions down the road, I think.
Right.
I think it's really interesting to take this, like the product marketplace idea, and I like, now that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense that like a lot of companies would go to AWS to find a lot of their software. And it sounds like a great opportunity for kind of getting a product out there.
The marketplaces are really, and I can't even remember where I read it. It was about AWS specifically, but the marketplaces are very much seeing themselves as one-stop shop for companies to consume software. And so that was kind of an eye-opener for me specifically with regard to, like, even if I'll show you an example, even if we go to AWS Marketplace and we look at, you know, you all hear me mention Zora a lot, so I'll bring that one up. It's a subscription billing system. It's a commercial software company. They've been around for a long time. I think they actually started out as open source, but that was years ago. So if you look at their product page on AWS Marketplace, under the pricing, under the pricing and the fulfillment options, so they're a SaaS product, meaning truly like they manage their own infrastructure. When you sign up for Zora, you don't deploy a container or something like that. They're responsible for all the infrastructure. You're paying them. In this case, you can see their pricing model here. They're 12, 24, 36 months. But they have different pricing models. Like, for example, they might charge you a % of the revenue that you bill through their platform. Things like 0.5% or something like that as a pricing model. The point I'm bringing up here is, like, if I were to click on, view purchase options here and actually go through some process of buying Zora through AWS, it is not what I normally thought about as working with AWS, meaning, I'm getting a server that I'm sizing. It's not about the infrastructure. Zora is managing all of that. They're paying all of those costs. I'm just buying software through this marketplace. And AWS is taking a fee on the top of that. So they're charging Zora. That's another part of the complexity in the business operations of these things, is like, you have to be able to run a process, for example, that says, this is a customer that came through AWS. AWS is going to take 3% of that. So I have to actually generate, like an invoice for the total amount that I'm billing, and then like a payable invoice for 3% of that. So it nets out to, the actual revenue you're making. But the point is, these software companies are selling their products through these marketplaces, even as SaaS products, not as, products that I'm just going to go like, I get a link to or a URL to a container image, and I'm gonna go size my infrastructure on AWS and deploy it. It's still all fully managed from more like a SaaS product, but the marketplace. And so AWS, and I'm sure GCP and Azure are trying to do the same thing, is they're trying to get these companies to just make it essentially their purchasing portal for all the different software. And if you've ever looked at any software company, and Alchemy may or may not be in this category, but there's okay, you sold out. All right. Alchemy may or may not have, every software company I work with, somebody somewhere in the organization has the picture. And it's the picture of the spaghetti mess of the 300 different tools and systems and applications that they're running very inefficiently and poorly put together, but they all do it because they've gone and run out and bought all these tools. And these marketplaces want you to buy all of that through their marketplace because they're going to make a percentage on that. And it's whether it's a very specific, like, I buy it and I deploy it on through AMI or a container, or it's more of like a SaaS purchase, they want that spend going through their marketplace and taking a margin off of that. So that's their model. That's their business model in terms of these marketplaces. And I think from a vendor perspective, whether it's software or professional services, it's more about like, then how do you leverage those marketplaces as a source for identifying customers? So we're almost at time. I know I've said a lot, went off on some tangents. I hope it was useful and informative. It's been somewhat of a learning experience for me, and I'm still going through it. But I think that anybody that feels like they've got an kind of a interesting thing they're doing with Moqui that could potentially be productized, it's not that hard to throw it out there on these marketplaces, and it's probably worth at least, you know, seeing what kind of traction we can get here.
That's great. Thanks, Vince. You were talking about a little bit before, because Moqui itself is not run by a commercial entity. There is no marketing and sales budget or anything like that. So it's really users of Moqui and what they end up doing with it. That's how it gets out into the world primarily. There might be more things we could do to promote the open source project. Well, there are definitely more things we could do to promote the open source project itself and make it more visible in the world. But this is probably one of the main means that it gets out, is through service companies, product companies, and so on that promote their own products and services that are based on Moqui. So I guess for the schedule, we have lunch coming up next. For those of us who are remote, I guess we're off to our own thing. And then I don't know if there was a planned lunch there in the conference room, but otherwise, yeah, everyone enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back here in just over an hour at 1 p.m. with the next session by Gurudaram Khalsa on lean startup. And he went through that with me the other day, and so he has some good material in there. Looking forward to hearing the real presentation. And with that, unless anyone has any other questions or comments, I'll stop the recording and we'll break for lunch. Good enough? Okay.
All right.